All right, welcome back, guys. Today we are going to do the digestive system. If you notice, we have digestion part 1 and part 2. I'm going to try to knock out both parts in a single lecture, so this might be a little bit of a lengthy one, so give yourself a good amount of time to listen. You can always pause, rewind, fast forward, whatever you want to do. But to get started with the digestive system, right, this is a long tube. That's really all it is. It is a tube from the mouth all the way to the anus. And the whole purpose of this is to take in nutrients, absorb those nutrients, and then excrete waste products that we don't need. So let's just give a little overview of the GI tract, right? We have several different structures. We have mouth, salivary glands, stomach, small intestines. And the reason I picked these ones out first for us today is because they deal with fluid intake and output and secretions. So our mouth, right, we ingest roughly around 1,200 milliliters of fluid a day. All right. Then our salivary glands, which we will talk a little bit more deeply into those in a second, our salivary glands then secrete upwards of 1,500 milliliters a day of whether it's salivary amylase, or which is primarily most of it, or it's some other kind of watery bicarb secretion, etc., etc. Our stomach, right? We make gastric acid juice in our stomach, and that is, around 2,000 milliliters a day, just depending upon how dense in protein your diet is, or just how much food you're taking in. The less amount of food you take in, the less amount of stomach acid that's secreted. The more food you take in, the more that is secreted, all right? And then in our small intestines, we have roughly about 1,500 milliliters of fluid secreted, and that's usually coming from the pancreas, right? The pancreas holds all our digestive enzymes. Hopefully you saw that when we were talking about endocrine and I asked you about exocrine versus endocrine. And we looked at seeing that, and we will look further that the gallbladder, right, stores our bile, and then that is also secreted right into the duodenum of the small intestine. So there's a lot of secretions going on in the small intestine. But for the most part, we think of the small intestine as our absorption phase, right? So we've digested, we've broken all of our food down, and then we get to absorb everything. And the small intestine is most notably known for absorption of nutrients. So our carbs, our fats, our proteins, some of that nucleic acid, that, those DNA, those are our 4 macromolecules, right? Then we have our large intestine, right? And most of us know our large intestine, also commonly called the colon, is our main water absorber, right? So we do not want to lose all that water there. Hopefully you're not having diarrhea bouts as a day-to-day occurrence. Maybe there's then something else going on if you are, but again, you want a semi-solid stool because you want to make sure your body was able to absorb back all of the water that you will then need to balance out all of the fluids in your body. And later this semester, we'll talk a little bit more about balancing fluids, and checking out that acid-base lecture just previously, you would know that we do have an acid-base balance in order to balance then even out fluids. So just some background notes as to structures and volumes in the GI tract. All right. Functions. What are the functions of our GI tract? Hopefully, like one of them comes, or several of them come right to the top of your head. Digestion, absorption, right? We have to digest all our materials, and that's just breaking down these macromolecules that we're eating. We have to be able to break down the Hardee's cheeseburger into the specific carbohydrate, lipid, and protein molecules, right? Absorb. We've got to then absorb all those nutrients back over into our bloodstream, right? So while they're digested, broken down in a tube, we've got to get them back in the bloodstream that's not in the tube, but it's on the opposite side of the tube, right? So those are two key functions. We also then have secretion, like we were just stating earlier, secretion of all these extra fluids, these enzymes, right? They help us to break down our food. Excretion, right? We have to get rid of waste products that are not necessary for everyday life. And that's then what ends up excreted out of your anus, right? And then last but not least, motility, right? So this is just movement down the long tube, right? Starting from the back of the mouth and in the pharynx all the way down the esophagus into the stomach, and then from the stomach into the small intestine, colon, and out. All right, so you have to have your nervous system in place in this. We have two different types of movement. We have peristalsis and we have segmentation, right? So our main one is peristalsis, and all this is like a contraction, a wave contraction in order to push food down the tube. Segmentation, on the other hand, is more of a churning and a mixing. It doesn't really necessarily move it in one direction or the other. It just helps to mix up food. But those are our two types of movement that we regularly see in the GI tract. All right, we have regulation. We have to regulate the GI reflexes, all right? And that is typically done by your enteric nervous system. I talked a little bit about this when we were going over in depth the nervous system, but right, your enteric nervous system is what controls your motility of your digestive system, all right? And again, it is deep within the muscular layer, and it plays in order to make sure that everything is working properly. Again, your enteric nervous system is under unconscious control. You don't have to tell your GI tract, hey, let's go ahead and digest this right now, right? The only two conscious things that you are under control of in your GI tract is chewing, right? Got to chew. You don't want to swallow a cheeseburger whole. And then secondly, swallowing, right? You can force yourself to swallow. And we all learned really how to swallow something weird and hopefully most of us still know how to swallow a pill. But do you ever remember trying to teach yourself to swallow a pill? Right? You could swallow food fine, but when it came to this whole pill thing, it took you a while. I don't know. It took me about 3 tries. I probably gagged about 1,000,000 times trying to do it. And I remember my mom wouldn't let me, go upstairs until I learned how to swallow the dang pill. But it's interesting that kind of a reflex. We have this gag reflex to try when we first learn how to swallow pills, and then now it's almost like you don't even need water. You can just throw it in the back of your mouth and boom, it's down the hatch. But again, those are under conscious controls, and your body knows how to deal with. Now, there is also then a deeper swallowing, and you can swallow unconsciously, right? You don't have to have necessarily conscious thought for that. Typically at night, you're still swallowing whether you think it or not. So swallowing can be both a conscious and an unconscious thought. That was just a little bit of a tangent. But again, remember there is regulation of our GI tract. And we also have, effectors of the GI tract. We have muscular layers. So this is kind of what this picture also is looking at. We have muscle layers of the GI tract, and we'll get into those in a second. We have exocrine glands and we have endocrine glands. Our exocrine glands are secreting digestive enzymes. Our endocrine glands are secreting hormones that allow for digestion to occur. We will look at both of those in the part 2. We have stimuli and inhibitors of our reflexes for our GI tract. We have stretch. Stretch can be a stimuli. We have acidity of GI tracts. That's typically an inhibitory response. There we go. Got that one out. If the contents of our stomach, if the contents that are coming out of the stomach are too acidic, it's almost like this whole, nope, you cannot go into the small intestine. And we'll see in our lab particularly, and what you're looking at now is the small intestine has about a pH of 6. And I think I told you in the last lecture, your gastric acid juices around a pH of 2. All right. You do not want that pH of 2 coming into your small intestine. It might burn a hole through your intestines. That would be called an ulcer. That's not good. All right, so that's usually an inhibitory reflex. We have osmolarity of GI contents. So depending on the molarity and whether it's in more of a hypertonic solution rather than, an isotonic solution, or if it's in a hypotonic solution, your body will sense that and be able to pick it up and say, wait, don't go. Okay, you can go now. And then lastly, we have digestion products. So we will see again in part 2 later, this little lecture part, whether or not your body is capable of moving forward. If there's too much acid, if there's too much fat, too much protein that's still not digested, it will keep it in the stomach. And so your stomach is kind of like, it's a weird stop sign. It's like the guys who are working on the side of the road that hold the stop and slow. Your stomach is that guy, right? He says either you stop or, you may progress but move slowly, kind of a thing. So I don't know what they're called, but I always wave to them because they're really nice. But anyhow, just wanted to go over a couple of those. And lastly, before I forget, you have 3 phases of digestion. You have the cephalic phase. All right. This is when we sense, smell, see, taste, think of food, right? And so just thinking of food or smelling food, you walk into a restaurant and you might not be overly hungry. Maybe your friends decided, hey, we want to grab dinner before we go see a movie. And you're like, crap, I just ate lunch like 2 hours ago. I don't really think I want to eat. But all of a sudden you walk into the restaurant wherever you all are and you smell food and you're like, I think I'm hungry all of a sudden. And it's like, whether you really are truly or not, it's your stomach starts to produce those acids because it's like, oh, I smell food, that therefore food is about to come. It's kind of like Pavlov's dogs, right? He trained them that when he would make a clicker, he'd present them food, they'd start to salivate, right? So then after several weeks of training these dogs in order to drool really it was to then associate a click with food, but he could click a button or a little noise maker and these dogs would start to drool just by hearing the click because they had then associated the click with food. And that's exactly what your stomach ends up doing. It associates the smell with, oh, food is coming, and therefore I will start to make room for it and I will start to produce these juices in order to digest it. So that's the cephalic phase. Then you have the gastric phase. This is where food actually then gets into your stomach. So you've actually been able to eat, right? And again, builds on stimulation. You've got everything going on. The churning, the segmentation is occurring. Last but not least, then you've got your intestinal phase. And this is when chyme, so your food starts out as a bolus. And once it is mixed up and perfectly arranged and everything is nice and slippery, if you will. That's probably a wrong word to use for this, but anyhow, it becomes chyme, right? And that is like fully digested watery substance that your stomach creates. And so the intestinal phase is when that chyme then enters into the duodenum or duodenum. You'll hear me say it 2 different ways because I just can't make up my mind, but we'll look at that in a little bit further as we go along. All right. So, needless to say, we've talked a little bit about some stuff. Let's go back here, look at the mesenteries. I think it's important that we do mention these. Your mesenteries are a fibrous areolar connective tissue that help to keep your GI tract organs in place, right? Think about it. We said one of the functions of the GI tract is motility. And as everything starts to move, you don't want your actual physical organs to start moving. You know how sometimes if you're not careful and the water hose is laid out and you haven't really put something heavy on it, and all of a sudden you turn it on and then the water hose starts like spraying all around and it's like a cartoon phase all over again, and you're like, oh my gosh, and then you end up getting all wet. That would be what your organs would be doing if we didn't have something tying them down, right? We do not want our organs moving in us. That would be, well, I don't even know. I don't even know what would happen, truthfully, but I think it would be pretty impressive, and I think it would cause a lot of pain, discomfort, definitely when you're trying to digest something and all of a sudden you feel like all of your organs moving around. Anyhow, but that's really the main goal of your mesenteries, is just to be an anchorage, all right? We've got then histology of our GI tract, right? We have specialized cells and tissues that create these villi, right? And anytime we have villi on our tissues, we now know, and we should associate the appearance of villi with increased surface area. And anytime you increase surface area, you increase your ability to absorb, right? Because more surface area means more room for absorption, and therefore you're able to get back more nutrients that your body needs. So you have four different layers to your epithelium of your GI tract. Your innermost layer, the layer that comes into contact with your food, is what we call the mucosa layer. All right. So also up here, this is what contains our mucosal epithelium, that lamina propria, muscularis mucosae. All of this is located within that mucosa layer. Just below your mucosa layer is your submucosa layer. This is what contains the blood vessels, the lymph system, the networks that we need in order to get food across. All right. So food is coming down this lumen, right? Lumen is just a special word for hole. It is absorbed through the mucosa layer and bam, right into the bloodstream. So there's our absorption phase. Right here is happening in this submucosa layer. Your submucosa layer also contains submucosal glands. So that's where we get a lot of our secretions of enzymes. All right, just underneath our submucosa layer, we have this muscular layer, right? And this muscular layer is typically made of smooth muscle. Again, it is primarily under autonomic nervous system control, our enteric nervous system particularly. Plus, right, the nice thing about smooth muscle is it can either function as one congruent muscle, but it can also segment, right? And this is due to its ability and by its connectedness with desmosomes and gap junctions, keeping smooth muscle in place. So we typically think of smooth muscle as it can either function as a whole unit or it can partial out or, kind of disperse itself and say only you work. So a good kind of illustration of this would be in your stomach. I'm just going to jump to this real fast. The fundus, which is this top portion of your stomach, and you have the body, the cardia, and then you have your pyloric part over here. Your stomach is pretty impressive that the fundus can work and contract while none of the other parts are contracting. The body can start to contract and then everything else is relaxed and not working. So this is what we see with smooth muscle. Its ability to turn on and off different portions of it. All right, so just kind of wanted to go through that. Your last layer of your layers of your epithelium, your histology of your GI tract, is the serosa. All right, this is the most external portion of your GI tract. It also contains blood vessels. It's more of our protection layer. Just wanted to throw that out. Please do note your 4 layers of your histology. Excuse me, that was a weird little yawn kind of thing going on. But yeah, so let's jump into this, right? Oops. Mechanical digestion. So everything starts in the GI tract as long as, you have a working esophagus, and you don't need necessarily a feeding tube. So everything is going to start in the mouth, right? Your mouth is an organ. Your accessory organs, though, to your GI tract, if you go back to a slide over here, right? Teeth and tongue and salivary glands, these are accessory organs to our GI tract, but all of which have something to do with digestion. And your main goal in your oral cavity, in your mouth, is to undergo mechanical digestion, the actual ripping, tearing, chewing, breaking of food. All right. And so that's what we call mastication. We also need our tongue in order to sense taste, right? So does something taste salty? Does something taste bitter? How about sour? Umami, right? We talked about those 5 senses last semester, and that's your tongue's job. We also get to initiate the swallowing. We talked about swallowing earlier. Whether the glottis and the epiglottis closes or opens determines where that food is going to go down. So let's talk about the glottis and the epiglottis, right? If we think about it, the glottis and the epiglottis help to ensure that the food does not go down the trachea. So normally, your glottis and your epiglottis are in a position where air, because your oral cavity in your nose share the same tube, the pharynx, with the respiratory system, right? So we have to ensure, because they both share a common tube, we have to make sure that there's times where air goes into then the trachea versus times where food goes down into the esophagus, right? So when we are talking about the epiglottis and the glottis, typically they're open. It's a flap located within or just below, I guess, the uvula in a weird sort of way. So if you can find the notch of your clavicle closest to your sternum, right? So that's your sternoclavicular joint and notch. Right there, if you push hard enough, you'll find that your Adam's apple, right, which is a ring of cartilage, which is just superior to all of this, that's typically where we think of, just below your Adam's apple, that's your trachea. So if you pushed hard enough, right, you could probably pop your trachea and then you'd have a nice hole in it. You wouldn't be able to breathe. We do not want food going down that tube. I repeat, you do not want to choke. That's what choking is. When something goes down, food particles go down into your trachea and causes you to choke. I've choked on many things. One would be a lifesaver. That was probably the most oxymoronic thing I've ever choked on. But anyhow, so you have this fun structure, our epiglottis. When food, once you swallow your food in the shape of mostly a bolus, it's kind of more of a spherical thing, it actually pushes down on the epiglottis and closes it closes the epiglottis, and that flap then closes over top of the trachea, forcing then the food to go back into the esophagus. So here's a fun little picture of it, right? So here's your epiglottis. That bolus pushes down on that flap, closes off the larynx and the trachea, and forces then the bolus to go down into the esophagus and finally land into the stomach. So those are some key points of making sure of mechanical digestion. You also have a bit, and I mean a bit, of chemical digestion in your mouth. More than likely you have tested this probably somewhere along your biology careers. Your teachers told you put a saltine cracker on your tongue, see how long it takes to dissolve, and for the most part a little piece of a saltine cracker kind of goes fast. This shows us that we have what is called salivary amylase within our oral cavity. It's secreted from the parotid gland, which is located pretty much right under that zygomatic arch, very close to your acoustic or external acoustic meatus, that hole where your ear is located. You also have sublingual glands. These are located right underneath your tongue. And then you have submandibular glands as well. Those are located just underneath your jaw, all of which secrete some form of an amylase that help to break down carbohydrates. Take the same experiment, put a piece of, I don't know, red meat, turkey, chicken, some kind of a protein on your tongue. See how long it takes to dissolve. Hint, it doesn't. All right, so you don't have the enzymes located in these salivary glands in order to break down anything but carbohydrates. So that's our big key point with that. You also have a unique structure for your salivary glands. Let's see here if I may be able to kind of draw this, but right, your salivary glands have this really cool shape where they have acini and ducts. So the circle is what we call acini. They're what are secreting our proteins, our enzymes, right? Our ducts, which is like this tube, this is what is secreting our electrolytes, our water. So pretty much bicarbonate and water. And this is how all glands, all our digestive system glands function in our body. And we will see this again when we start talking about in the pancreas. They have all of these acini. Acini, I think, is Greek for grape or something of that. Maybe it's more Latin for grape. Anyhow, but these are these clusters. And so some of these really cool pictures show that all of this helps to then secrete and get out these digestive enzymes. And again, in the salivary glands, it's all just a carbohydrate enzyme in order to break down and allow for digestion. All right, so we have a few functions of saliva. Number one function of saliva is to lubricate food, right? You do not want to swallow your food without it being at least coated with something. All right, try thinking about swallowing potato chips. Yeah, you could break them up with your teeth, but if there is nothing to lubricate those sharp little edges, and I know we've all done it, we've swallowed a chip whole and you feel like you've scratched the back of your throat. I mean, you have. That would be what you'd be doing on a day-to-day basis if there was no saliva in your salivary glands, if you didn't produce saliva. And there is a condition where some people don't produce saliva. It's the same kind of condition. It's very similarly related to those that do not create their own tears, right? So you're missing the ducts. You're missing the ability to produce a watery secretion, right? Saliva also helps to mediate a sense of taste. It's pretty impressive. We have facilitating of speech, right? Half of the reason you can talk is because you're not in dry mouth all the time. If you've ever noticed, and sometimes, when I'm up there talking with you all, my mouth gets extremely dry and I have to go back and, get my water out and, take a sip because I've talked all of the saliva out of my mouth, and it's very hard to continue to talk when you have dry mouth, right? It contains an amylase. We just talked about that. That's starch digestion. We have growth factors in our saliva. That's what helps wounds to heal. This is why, you might think it's always crazy that, you have a little paper cut and the first thing you do is try to lick it, or you lick another finger and then put it over. That is a innate habit that we have still in our brain, right? So it's the same reason that we look at and we're like, how does the little baby cow know to stay right around mom, and mom knows to lick the little baby cow right after she gives birth to it, blah, blah, blah. It is an innate instinct in the brain of the cow or whatever animal we're talking about. Same with why we lick our own little paper cuts. Or you get a big old scratch out on a soccer field, and the first thing you do is you lick your hand and you try to go wipe it. Don't tell me you haven't done it before, ladies and gentlemen. I know you have. It's because we instinctively know that our saliva heals wounds, right? And because it also contains antimicrobial factors, which help, fight off bacteria, fungus, viruses, and it's our first line of defense. All right. Some of the regulation of salivary secretion is both under parasympathetic and sympathetic control. So don't get overly complicated by that. It's not worth your time. So once we swallow our food, that bolus, we go then into the stomach. Unfortunately, you can't see anything that I'm looking at right now. There we go. Now we are back. So let's talk about the stomach, right? I mentioned we have the fundus. The fundus is the upper region where food enters. We have the body, middle portion, the site of pacemaker cells. So your stomach also has that pacemaker ability, just like your heart. And then the antrum of your stomach. This is the lower region and propels chyme into the small intestine. Then you have your pyloric area right here. Some of your gastric glands located within your stomach. You have mucus cells, also known as goblet cells. These help to secrete and produce mucins. All right? That's all they do. It's mucus because, again, you do not want to put a hole in your stomach. These G cells right here, these guys, they are producing gastric acid juice, right? They are, and what we call, gastrin. And these parietal cells as well. Let's see, are parietal cells on here? I don't think they are. But parietal cells are also secreting acid, right? Mainly the parietal cells are secreting this acid. And if you create so much acid because you're eating a lot of protein, because our stomach is mostly for digestion of protein. So the more protein you eat, the higher your stomach acid contents are going to be. If you do not have a layer of mucus covering your stomach in order to make sure you don't rip a hole through it, you are going to rip a hole through it if there's no layering. So we need these goblet cells, our mucus cells, in order to produce mucin, giving us a nice thin coat of a barrier. We have our chief cells, these like pinkish guys over here. Our chief cells produce pepsinogens, These allow for protein digestion. So we need pepsinogen, which is a precursor to then pepsin, and this is a way then to digest proteins. All right, and we'll see that in a little bit. Just mentioned the G cells. Our G cells produce gastrin that helps to stimulate stomach motility and secretion. Then we have the parietal cells. I found them. They're kind of like the orangey guys, I guess. Our parietal cells are the ones that secrete our stomach acid. And make this a key point, intrinsic factor. All right. Intrinsic factor is vital for B12 absorption. Why do we need B12? Does anybody know off the top of their head? So if you know why we need B12, hopefully you were able to answer that question. The point of B12, also known as cobalamin, it helps with our nervous system, right? So individuals who are deficient in B12 typically are very tired, lethargic. They can be anemic because B12 is needed for red blood cell development, specifically in the red bone marrow. So without B12, you can feel some tingling and numbness because B12 is also used when producing myelin, of that myelin sheath, right? Created by the Schwann cells of our nervous system. So we need B12. You find B12 in red meats and eggs and dairy. So typically, individuals who are very diehard strict vegans need to take a B12 supplement in order to get the necessary amounts of B12, unless you know how to get all of the B12 in your diet. And again, this is why individuals who start out, going vegan and try to jump right into it real hard, that first year, if they don't do their research properly they will become nutrient deficient in a lot of key minerals, vitamins and minerals, because they don't know how to make complete meals in order to satisfy all of these nutrient requirements. So somebody who has been a vegan or has practiced veganism for several years knows, okay, if I combine these two foods, I can actually get about 20% of what I need. And if I do this, several times a day, look, I'm already up to at least like 60% of my daily nutritional requirements on this. But it's very difficult to get all of your B vitamins without some form of a dairy, eggs, red meat. So sometimes their doctors do say, please get on a B12 supplement. Even yourself, you may not even be vegan or vegetarian, but if you're feeling very lethargic, your mood is all shifty, you might have some tingling, numbness, a B vitamin supplement is not a bad thing. Again, there's biotin in it. We have niacin, we have cobalamin, all of which are good for your body just in general. So if you want to try a B vitamin supplement, go right ahead. It may or may not help you. I am not a doctor, so don't heed my advice with all utmost greatness. But anyhow, moving on from that is why the parietal cells are so important. So if you start to kill off your parietal cells, you're not going to be able to then absorb and take in B12, which is extremely necessary. All right, functions of your stomach. Pretty basic. We have to fragment and mix food, make it into chyme, and move it into our small intestine. That is the main goal of our stomach. Mix up our food so it can go into the duodenum. We have to secrete certain gastric secretions, right? We just saw pepsinogen, gastrin, hydrochloric acid. And again, that pepsin is for digestion of proteins. So PPs, proteins, pepsins, we've got it. All right, functions of the stomach acid. So the reason we have to have our stomach so acidic by these parietal cells is the acidity actually converts the pepsinogen secreted by the chief cells into pepsin. So pepsinogen into pepsin is done by the high acidity of your stomach, right? Also, that stomach acid denatures proteins, so breaks them down even further, and it kills off bacteria, microbes that you might have ingested, right? So it's also got, kind of an immune function to it. All right. So how is our gastric functions regulated? All right. We have stimuli and basic electrical rhythm. This is because, again, your stomach has its own pacemaking ability, and it depolarizes about every 3 to 5 times a minute. Right? So it's kind of shooting off its own, yay, let's go. So is that faster or slower than the heart? Hopefully you know that is much slower than the heart, because again, you do not need your stomach in order to pump all the blood into your body. All right. We have inhibitors of whether the gastric contents go into the duodenum, right? If it's too low in pH, therefore it's too acidic, it will still continue to stay in the stomach until it kind of neutralizes out a little bit. If there are too many fatty acids present, it will not go into the small intestine yet. That it typically gets stuck here in this pyloric area, and right here is where we also then have the incoming from the pancreas. We also have that where we get a little bit of digestion, or most of the digestion of our fatty acids right in this weird space called this pyloric space, the pylorus, and we have our pyloric sphincter over here as well. And last but not least, if they are hypertonic contents. So again, if they're not lubricated enough, if the chyme is too saturated by solutes, it's not going to be released into the duodenum. All right. So moving on, we've got then some accessory organs that we must talk about. As you can see here, we've got a pancreas. Gosh darn it. It looks like a corn cob or an ear of corn, however you want to say. It's got both the exocrine and the endocrine functions. We talked about the endocrine being the release of insulin and glucagon and somatostatin, and we'll talk about somatostatin a little bit later. But insulin and glucagon also play in the digestive system. So it's not like its endocrine and exocrine functions are necessarily in two separate systems. They're both actually in the digestive system. You secrete insulin when you just have eaten a meal. You are secreting glucagon when you're in a fasted state. The exocrine functions, which are secreting amylases, lipases, proteases, DNA and RNases, which are all digestive enzymes in order to break down their corresponding macromolecule, is also then within the digestive system, right? Again, same structure to this organ in its exocrine gland functions. It's got that acini and the duct system. The acini, again, is secreting all of the digestive enzymes. The ducts are secreting that H2O, that water, and that bicarb, right? And again, that all helps to mix, and specifically that bicarbonate, we looked with the acid-base buffer system. That bicarbonate is there in order to neutralize the acidity of the stomach acid contents. And so that is why we might get stopped and backed up here in this pyloric area. And if the stomach is too acidic, if it's still too acidic, it's not going to go into the duodenum, right? So we have to wait and make sure that the pancreas is secreting the proper amount of bicarb in order to neutralize that acidity back out, all right? And you can see here, right, your pancreas also then inserts in and comes into this common bile duct. That common bile duct is coming from the liver and the gallbladder, right? So functions of the liver: produces plasma proteins. It causes our energy metabolism, right? We get breakdowns of glucose. We have detoxification. It produces bile. Bile is necessary for breaking down fats. It's an emulsifier. It's like your dishwashing soap, right? The reason that soap can break down the fatty scum and dirt on your dishes is because it's emulsifying those food particles. That's exactly what bile is doing. It's wrapping itself around a fatty acid and able to break it down. Oh, here's a great picture if you wanted to look further into these acini. So these acini are these funny little, almost like a grape cluster, and then the duct. So theirs is a much prettier picture than mine ever could be, but this is what that is. That was just a side note. But back to bile being an emulsifier. So let's see if I can kind of draw this out for you. It might be a little bit rough sketch, but so, right, we've got our fatty acid that we typically, we're just going to draw our fatty acid today as a square. All right. Fatty acid, it's our lipid, right? The whole point of an emulsifier, our bile, is to actually physically, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore, guys. It causes a more like a wrap, if you will, and puts a circle around, or some kind of a container around each fatty acid individually, and causes that actually to physically break up. So this is what we mean by an emulsifier. And so our liver produces the bile. The bile then is stored within our gallbladder and then is secreted out of this common bile duct into this area when necessary. So the higher the fat content of your meal, the more bile that is secreted. So if you've ever, gotten a really fatty meal and you've eaten it and you're then at home afterwards and you're like, oh my goodness, like, the left side of my stomach is killing me, because we go back up here to where everything is in life, right? Just right underneath your stomach. I guess it's more so on the right side. I apologize for that. If that is all of a sudden, like, just even kind of like it's almost like the middle, and you're like, oh, I'm like cramping, I'm hurting, something hurts. It's likely due to the fact that you had so much bile secreted out of the gallbladder and into that common bile duct in order to be able to digest that fatty meal. All right. So regulation of bile secretion is under the control of a special hormone called CCK, cholecystine kinase. Don't worry about the big long name. We'll just refer to it by CCK from here on out. And also secretin, which increases the bicarb secretion. And again, we'll talk about that a little later. So don't go too freaky on me just yet. We have the small intestine, right? The small intestine is broken up into three parts. We have the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. It's got these folds that help to increase surface area, right? We need that increase in surface area because the whole point of the small intestine is to absorb our fats, our carbs, and our proteins. We still get a little bit of digestion here in the duodenum, but once we get into the jejunum, it is all about absorption of our nutrients. Right? That's the whole point of the small intestine. And again, motility is done mainly by segmentation here, where we have this mixing and churning of the contents with our digestive enzymes, all in which to then get an increase in absorption. And then we also have the migrating motility complex, which deals with the longitudinal muscles, and it helps to bring the contents towards the colon. So it's causing this whole go down, 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 all the way around up until we get into this area right here where the ileocecal valve is, and allows us to then absorb stuff into our colon. Again, we have said your colon is broken down into the ascending, the transverse, and the descending. Then we have our sigmoid colon right here. The whole purpose of your colon is to absorb sodium, chloride, ions, and water. All right, we absorb up to anywhere between 1.5 and 2 liters of water a day just from the colon. It secretes mucus. Again, you've got to kind of lubricate that waste material, the stuff you're not digesting, because you do not want a rock coming from or going out of your anus. I mean, that will be causing hemorrhoids, which most of the population at some point in their life will have hemorrhoids because of the food choices now that we have the ability to eat. We cause a whole lot of damage to this rectum and anus part, and that can really affect and cause some discomfort down there. All right. We also then store fecal matter here, right? You can store fecal matter upwards of 18 to 24 hours a day. Hopefully, you are eating enough fiber in your diet that you have regular bowel movements and you can almost, time it and know that, okay, I typically have to, release my bowels at this time. I know for some of you, this is like, oh my gosh, she's really talking about this. But again, this is a physiological process. You've got to understand that if something isn't working properly down here, it's a whole slew of problems. Constipation. If you are a cheese junkie and all you do is eat cheese all the time and you always wonder why you feel constipated, it's because of the dairy in the cheese. Dairy is our big number one constipator. All right. You could probably be constipated, and some people can be constipated from like 48 to, over 7 days. Can you imagine not having a bowel movement for 7 days? That's not good. That's not something you want to be proud of, people. Do not hold in your poo. Go ahead and dump it. If you need to, it's okay. And I know some of you are like, oh my gosh, I can't do it in a public place. Go ahead. It is not necessarily a good thing to continue to hold it in. All right. But on the flip side, if you're not able to reabsorb all of the excess water here in your colon, you might have bouts of diarrhea all the time. Go get that checked out, guys. You should not just be having diarrhea left and right and just be like, oh, this is so normal. Now, unless you're eating a very, very high fibrous diet, and again, fiber, we cannot absorb fiber, right? That's why eating fruits and vegetables are good for us, because it allows us to keep the system, quote unquote, regular. But if you're, eating so much fiber, you might be having more bouts of diarrhea than the rest of us. All right. So just some things to think about. Regulation of the colon is done primarily by aldosterone. We will talk much more in depth about that when we get into the urinary system, so I'm not even going to go much into it. But for the main purpose of the colon, it's just to transport that fecal matter through it and then release it via the rectum and then into the anus. Now, quickly though, while I'm still at this point, I want to tell you have 2 different sphincters. located within your anus. You have an external and an internal sphincter. Your internal sphincter is under involuntary control. It is made up of smooth muscle. You cannot control it. It is all of a sudden when you all get, you're sitting there and you're like, ooh, I think I have to go. That's because it's probably just passed through the internal sphincter. Now it's pushing on the external sphincter of your anus. Now, your external sphincter is under conscious control. It's made up of skeletal muscle, right? So you can control that one. And that's why, you can be sitting in a long car ride and be like, okay, I'm going to continue to hold it in, You're able to do that because of your external sphincter. All right, so just wanted to cover those two types of sphincters. I will probably ask you about them, to say the least. Now, briefly, let me just sum this up by taking you through step by step all of the different passageways I want you to know what everything goes through. All right, so we start in the mouth. From the mouth, we go into the pharynx. From the pharynx into the esophagus. The esophagus, we go through the cardioesophageal sphincter. From there into the stomach, out the pyloric sphincter, into the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum. Through the ileocecal valve, in the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, sigmoid colon, into the rectum. Then we go through the internal sphincter, external sphincter, anus out. Ba-boom. All right. There is likely going to be a question about take me through the entire pathway. You need to be able to recite that, or at least type it out for me. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I think I am going to go ahead, cut this one at the point, and then I will start back up with the part 2 of this lecture in another video. So again, look back at all of this, listen to it a couple of times. It shouldn't be overly difficult. We really just went through the histology, the functions of these different organs. All in all, something you've probably already heard before. All right, meet you on the next one.